It was Saturday night at Altiplano, the Alcatraz of Mexico. It was supposed to be the most secure prison in the country. At 9 p.m., the facility's most high-value prisoner stepped into the shower corner of his solitary cell. He never walked out. This escape had been months in the making. The prisoner knew the surveillance layout perfectly. The cameras watched him 24 hours a day, but they had exactly one blind spot: the shower stall. In that small corner of privacy, a section of the floor had been cut away. The prisoner slipped inside, found a ladder, and climbed down 30 feet into the darkness. Waiting for him at the bottom was a tunnel and a getaway vehicle. A modified motorcycle, bolted to steel rails, was ready to roll. An associate was waiting. They gunned the engine and sped through the underground passage. The track stretched for nearly a mile. At the end of the line, they climbed a ladder and emerged inside an unfinished house, far beyond the prison walls. When the guards finally checked the cell, it was empty. The only thing they found was the hole in the floor. And one witness. A sparrow was fluttering around the tunnel entrance. The digging crew had used birds to test the air quality underground. The bird was still there. But the elusive kingpin was gone. He had escaped. Again. Joaquín Guzmán. The world knows him as El Chapo. He was one of the most powerful crime lords in history. To many in Mexico, he was more powerful than the government itself. But his empire was built on bones. Estimates suggest he was responsible for the slaughter and disappearance of tens of thousands of people. For decades, the authorities hunted him. A few times they actually caught him. But El Chapo had a talent for vanishing. He slipped through the fingers of justice time and again, just like he did in that tunnel in 2015. But even that wasn't the end. It was just one chapter in a 30-year war. This is the story of the hunt for the world's most elusive kingpin. By the 2000s, the world had changed. Social media was everywhere, and the rich loved to flaunt their lives online. The young generation of the cartel, the so-called Narco juniors, were no exception. They flooded the internet with photos of gold-plated guns, stacks of cash, and luxury parties. Their motto was reckless: better to live one good year as a king than 10 bad years as a slave. But the leader of Mexico's most powerful cartel disagreed. At 57, Joaquín Guzmán knew that in his business, fame is fatal. He valued silence. He spent most of his time deep in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Sinaloa, the rugged land where he was born and where he built his empire. By 2014, El Chapo was the most wanted fugitive on the planet. His organization, the Sinaloa Cartel, was a global superpower. But mystery is a crucial part of the legend. For a long time, the public barely knew what he looked like. Only a handful of photos existed. One of the earliest was taken in 1993, after his first arrest. It shows a young, rising crime lord in a winter jacket. And there is a fascinating story behind that picture. Guzmán was born in the late 50s in a poor mountain village in western Mexico. His father was a farmer who grew corn and opium poppies. Joaquín was the oldest child. He dropped out of elementary school to work the fields with his dad. He was uneducated, but he wasn't stupid. He started as an apprentice to a powerful cartel boss, learning the dark arts of the trade. They nicknamed him El Chapo, Shorty, because of his height. But his ambition was towering. Guzmán had instincts, energy, and a ruthless drive. By the late 1980s, the farm boy had become a boss. It began with a disco bar in a coastal town. The place was packed. Guzmán's men arrived with a plan. First, they cut the telephone lines leading to the building. No police, no ambulances. Then the hitmen went inside. Their targets were members of a rival cartel, competitors El Chapo wanted to eliminate to expand his territory. The shooters opened fire on the crowd. 6 people dropped dead, but it was a botched job. All the victims were innocent civilians. The actual targets? They had been in the restroom when the shooting started. Hearing the screams, they managed to escape through a back window, alive and untouched. 6 months later, in 1993, they took their revenge. Guzmán arrived at the Guadalajara airport. A hit squad was waiting for him. Bullets started flying the moment he stepped out of his car. El Chapo, displaying the survival instinct that would become his trademark, managed to sprint to safety and hide. He didn't take a scratch, but the bystanders weren't so lucky. 7 innocent people were killed in the crossfire. Among the dead was a cardinal, a famous archbishop. Killing a high-ranking clergyman in a deeply Catholic country caused a massive national scandal. The heat was too much. El Chapo tried to flee across the border into Guatemala, but his luck ran out. He was captured, extradited to Mexico, and that is when the legendary 1993 photo was taken. You can still see the lack of experience in the eyes of the young crime lord. He was sentenced to 20 years and sent to Puente Grande, a maximum security prison in the West. He stayed there for only 8 years, and they were comfortable years. Even behind bars, the kingpin lived a life of luxury. He ordered lobster for dinner and brought in prostitutes for entertainment. But most importantly, he didn't stop working. He wasn't just surviving in prison, he was CEO. He ran his bloody business from his cell, and under his remote command, the empire actually grew. Then came January 2001. The guards checked Guzmán's cell. It was empty. Few people in Mexico were surprised. The official story is that El Chapo hid in a laundry cart under a pile of dirty sheets, wheeled out by a bribed employee. But almost no one believes that. The rumor on the street is simpler. Guzmán had bought the entire prison staff. He likely just walked out the front door. For the next few years, the government tried to hunt him down, but they only got close twice. For years, the hunt was a game of cat and mouse. In 2004, the Mexican army descended on a ranch in Sinaloa. They had him cornered, but a phone rang at the last second, a tip-off. By the time the boots hit the ground, El Chapo had vanished into the mountains. In 2007, he got even bolder. He decided to get married for the 3rd time. He threw a massive party, inviting half the criminal underworld. The army crashed the reception with helicopters, ready to make the arrest of the century. But once again, the groom was gone. He had been warned before the rotors were even audible. Guzmán had a superpower: corruption. He didn't just bribe police officers, he bought entire departments. American intelligence knew exactly where he was, but they were paralyzed. They had no jurisdiction. They had to pass the intel to their Mexican counterparts. And the moment they did, the information leaked straight to Chapo. But bribes were only half the equation. The other half was terror. Even when the authorities captured his men, nobody talked. Snitching on El Chapo didn't just mean losing your life. It meant signing a death warrant for your entire family. With tens of thousands dead in the cartel wars, everyone knew the threat was real. And finally, there was the geography. El Chapo spent most of his time in the Golden Triangle, the remote mountains of Sinaloa. He was protected by an army of hundreds, and the terrain was a natural fortress. It was impossible to approach him unseen. But occasionally, the king wanted to come down from the mountain. When El Chapo craved a nice dinner in the city, his security team executed a surreal ritual. Gunmen would enter a restaurant and lock the doors. They would move from table to table, politely but firmly collecting every cell phone in the room. "Do not worry," they would say. "The boss is eating. You will be safe." Guzmán would enter, eat his meal in peace, pay the bill for every single table, return the phones, and disappear into the night. His organization was built to protect him. It wasn't a traditional mafia hierarchy. It was structured like a terrorist network. It was a web of autonomous cells. The soldiers on the street never spoke to the lieutenants, and the lieutenants never spoke to the boss. American intelligence was intercepting hundreds of calls and emails, but they couldn't penetrate the inner circle. By the end of the 2000s, the legend was cemented. El Chapo was a ghost. El Chapo had a favorite tool, the BlackBerry. Among the cartel elite, these phones were considered the gold standard. They believed the encryption was unbreakable and trusted the fact that the manufacturer was Canadian, not American. But they were wrong. In 2012, American intelligence cracked the code. They gained access to Guzmán's communications. The game of cat and mouse had officially begun. In February, the signal lit up. Guzmán was heading to a coastal resort town in the west to meet an escort. Despite having 3 wives and countless mistresses, the kingpin had a weakness for call girls. And that weakness created a digital trail. U.S. intelligence tracked the BlackBerry signal to a luxury mansion on the coast. They relayed the coordinates to the Mexican Marines. They raided the house, weapons drawn, but the ghost was gone. Likely warned seconds before the breach, he had slipped out the back door. Now it was a foot race. El Chapo was trying to flee the city and get back to the safety of the mountains. The military was hot on his tail, following the blinking dot of his phone signal. But Guzmán realized the pattern. He understood that the phone was the leash leading the dogs to him. So he pulled a classic magician's trick. He met up with a low-level associate, handed him the BlackBerry, and sent him running in the opposite direction. The soldiers followed the signal. They cornered their target, tackled him, and looked at his face. It wasn't El Chapo. While the army was chasing a decoy, Guzmán had reached the desert. A small Cessna was waiting for him on a dirt airstrip. He boarded the plane and vanished into the sky, heading back to the impenetrable fortress of the Sinaloa Mountains. After the near miss, El Chapo's paranoia went into overdrive. His communication system became a nightmare to track. Sending a message was now a multi-layered black op. The order would pass to a chain of trusted couriers, hopping between devices before finally reaching the boss. It was human encryption. But American intelligence was patient. Eventually, they cracked the pattern. They arrested key members of his inner circle, and the grid lit up again. They had a location. The Mexican government decided to change tactics. The regular army was too slow and too leaky. They deployed the Marines, specifically an elite special forces unit within SEMAR. Unlike the regular troops, these operators were fast, lethal, and invisible. OPSEC was absolute. Only the top commanders knew the targets. The soldiers had to surrender their phones before the briefing. No leaks, no warnings. In 2014, the unit launched Operation Gargoyle. The target? Joaquín Guzmán. Intelligence placed him in Culiacán, the capital of Sinaloa. They knew he never slept in the same place 2 nights in a row, but they had the address for tonight. The Marines hit the house hard. They brought a battering ram to breach the front door. They swung it with enough force to shatter a normal entrance. But the door didn't budge. It wasn't just steel, it was an engineering marvel. The reinforced door was filled with water. Usually, the friction from a battering ram heats up the metal, making it soft and pliable. But here, the water absorbed the energy and cooled the steel instantly. It was impenetrable. For 10 agonizing minutes, the Marines hammered away. Those 10 minutes saved El Chapo's life. When they finally broke through, the house was silent. The coffee was still warm, but the rooms were empty. In the master bathroom, the soldiers found something straight out of a spy movie. The bathtub had been raised at a 45-degree angle. Hidden behind the mirror was a hydraulic switch that activated a trapdoor beneath the tub. It led into a dark, narrow tunnel. Minutes earlier, hearing the thunder of the battering ram, Guzmán and his bodyguards had triggered the mechanism and jumped in. They were moving fast, too fast. El Chapo didn't even have time to put on his shoes. He was running for his life, barefoot, his feet cut and bleeding on the rough concrete. The secret tunnel opened up into the city's storm drains. The most powerful man in Mexico was now sprinting through the filth and darkness of the sewers, wading through waste. Above ground, the city was on lockdown. American drones circled the sky. Marines swept the streets. But they were too late. The soldiers tracked the tunnel to the riverbank where the sewage emptied out. But there was no one there. The ghost had vanished into the night. He had escaped. again. The tunnel wasn't just an exit, it was a labyrinth. When the Marines mapped it out, they realized it connected to not just one, but 6 different safe houses. But El Chapo was trapped. The city was swarming with soldiers. The escape routes to the mountains were blocked. He had to go to ground, and he made a fatal error. El Chapo's phone was dead, but his shadows wasn't. Intelligence picked up a signal from one of his bodyguards. The dot on the map pointed to the coast, to the resort town of Mazatlan. The signal was coming from the Hotel Miramar, a white high-rise overlooking the ocean. Early Saturday morning, the operation began. SEMAR Marines surrounded the building. The front desk confirmed that 2 rooms had been rented the night before, one on the 6th floor, one on the 4th. The team breached the 6th floor first. They kicked in the door, weapons ready, only to find 2 terrified American tourists. Wrong room. Simultaneously, the second team hit the 4th floor. This time, they found the target. They intercepted the bodyguard whose phone had betrayed them. He and the small security detail were armed, but they didn't fire a shot. They were vastly outnumbered. To stay mobile in the city, Chapo had traveled light. It cost him his freedom. The Marines moved to the master suite. There they found the most dangerous man in the world, along with his beauty queen wife and their twin daughters. The kingpin surrendered without a fight. He was flown to Mexico City. On the tarmac, the world saw the now famous image, El Chapo in a white shirt and dark jeans, held by masked soldiers. He was surprisingly calm, polite even. He told the Marines that he was scheduled to fly back to the safety of the mountains the very next day. He looked at his captors and said simply, "I can't believe you caught me." The capture was monumental. The president of Mexico announced it personally on Twitter. For years, the government had promised to crush the cartels. Results were scarce. So when they finally paraded El Chapo before the cameras, the public was skeptical. Many didn't believe it was him. The ghost hadn't been seen in decades. Was it a body double? The authorities had to run fingerprint and DNA tests just to prove to the world that the man in handcuffs was actually Joaquín Guzmán. Now the question was political. What to do with him? The United States demanded immediate extradition. They wanted him in an American supermax, but Mexico refused. The Attorney General declared that El Chapo would stay. There was a matter of national pride. He had to serve his time in Mexico for the crimes committed against Mexicans. The victims were in the tens of thousands. Why should he be judged anywhere else? The Mexican government made a solemn promise. The embarrassment of 2001 would not be repeated. El Chapo would not escape. Well, he did, and he did it in spectacular fashion. At first, Altiplano prison seemed escape-proof. Guzmán was in a solitary cell with 24-hour video surveillance. But El Chapo had a plan before the cell door even locked. His wife, Emma, was allowed to visit. She became the courier, passing messages between the kingpin and his engineers on the outside. The plan was audacious: a tunnel. First, his men bought an unfinished house exactly 1 mile away from the prison walls. They started digging. To ensure they hit the target perfectly, a GPS-enabled watch was smuggled into Guzmán's cell. He used it to transmit his exact coordinates to the mining crew. This wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was an engineering marvel. It cost an estimated $5 million. The tunnel had ventilation, electricity, and oxygen tanks. It was reinforced against collapse. As the digging got closer, other prisoners complained about the noise beneath the floors. The guards ignored them. The tunnel ended directly under the only blind spot in Guzmán's cell, the shower. On that Saturday night in July 2015, the trap was sprung. Guzmán slipped into the hole, dropped down, and straddled the modified motorcycle waiting on the rails. It took 18 minutes for the guards to check the empty cell. By then, El Chapo was gone. He surfaced in the safe house, switched to a van, then a plane. Before the sun came up, he was back in the mountains of Sinaloa. A week later, he called a meeting of his top lieutenants. It was business as usual. After his first jailbreak in 2001, El Chapo remained a ghost for over a decade. In those years, his power and wealth hit stratospheric levels. Most people in Mexico assumed history would repeat itself. They expected another 10 years of failure. They thought it would take an eternity to find him again, but they were wrong. The game had changed between 2001 and 2015. American and Mexican law enforcement had evolved. They had mastered the art of digital manhunting. Guzmán had a fatal problem. To run an empire, you have to give orders. You have to communicate. And communication was his Achilles heel. U.S. intelligence was already inside the network, tracking the phones of his inner circle, mapping the web of associates. The agents were confident. This time the hunt wouldn't take a decade. The clock was already ticking. Early one morning, a squad of SEMAR Marines surrounded a safe house in a small coastal city in Sinaloa. The silence was shattered by the boom of a battering ram. After the seventh strike, the door gave way. The Marines stormed in. Gunfire erupted immediately. The team moved room to room, clearing the ground floor, then the second. When the smoke cleared, several bodyguards were dead. The rest were in handcuffs. But the main target, the stocky man with the dark hair, was gone. As the breach began, El Chapo and his lead security guard had stepped into a closet and descended into the sewers. They navigated the filth for a mile and popped up through a manhole cover in the middle of a busy street, right across from a shopping mall. They carjacked a vehicle and sped off. It looked like the old magic was working again, but this time, luck was not on his side. Policía Federal pulled the stolen car over on the highway. They held them at gunpoint until the Marines arrived. The game was over. At first, it looked like déjà vu. He was sent back to Altiplano. His associates immediately bought land nearby. The digging crews started working again. They even spent $2 million trying to bribe officials to move him back to a cell accessible by tunnel. But it didn't work. El Chapo didn't know that his extradition paperwork had been signed before he was even captured. In January 2017, agents loaded him onto a private jet. He likely thought he was being transferred to another Mexican prison. But when the wheels touched down and he looked out the window, he saw an American airport. His nightmare had become reality. 2 years later, Joaquín Guzmán stood before a federal judge in New York. He listened to his sentence: life imprisonment plus 30 years. He was sent to the Alcatraz of the Rockies, ADX Florence in Colorado. It is the most secure prison on Earth. No one has ever escaped. We explored the terrifying engineering of this facility in our video, Prison: How the State Uses Pain, Control, and Power. If you want to see where El Chapo will die, check it out. With El Chapo gone, what happened to his business? Nothing. If the CEO of Apple disappears tomorrow, people don't stop buying iPhones. The board just hires a new director. The machine keeps running. The cartel was no different. The legend of El Chapo was bigger than the man himself. Hollywood producers fought for the rights to his life story. But in reality, he was just a cog in the wheel. Famous, but replaceable. In Mexico, there is a genre of music called narco corridos, ballads that glorify the exploits of drug lords. The bands still play the trumpets and guitars. The genre is more popular than ever, but they don't sing about El Chapo anymore.